they did let me make mistakes. And to be fair, I did make quite a few. But I think that's a good thing because I've learned from them. So in the same environment or in similar environments in the future, I'm going to be in a place where I've been there and I've done that, right? So.
Hello and welcome back to Future You, the Early Careers and Student Advice podcast brought to you by Prospects.
So I'm Kaiyan. I study psychology at University of East Anglia. This is my fourth year now. It's a 4-year course, so this is my final year. In my third year, I did a placement at Enterprise Mobility.
So how did you find that placement?
Yeah, so I stumbled across it. So every, I think it was month or week, one of the two, we'd have a bulletin that our careers team called Career Central would kind of publish or email out to all the placement students, essentially. And every week I'd go through them. A lot of the time, it was, as I say, a lot of them were finance related, one necessarily related to my degree or my interests. But on one occasion, that the Enterprise Mobility advertisement came up. I ticked all the boxes. You know, it was based in London. I'm from London. So that was obviously a big thing. I didn't want to move out, and that's a lot of money and a lot of commitment. So that was a big box. And I kind of applied. It was a little bit out of my comfort zone. It wasn't psychology related. But I tried to kind of link my skills to the role and thankfully I got the job.
And what was the application process like? Was it just a simple fill in a form or was there a long process?
Yeah, so I found that when I was applying for like the huge corporate kind of giants, I guess you could say, there was that kind of 8 stage application process, you know, assessment centers and etc. Whereas Enterprise was a lot more kind of streamlined in the sense that I had obviously the initial application, which was, you know, background, CV. Can't actually remember if there was a cover letter, but I think there was a lot of applications I would do cover letters for, so most likely. And then once you, obviously they've looked through that, they get back to you, and then the next stage is a phone interview. So you'll get a call from one of the talent acquisition team members. They have a quick discussion with you, kind of gauge, you know, why you're looking for that particular role, why do you think you'd suit that role. Somewhat of an informal interview, I'd say. But it was a very casual conversation. I didn't feel too pressured. And then once obviously they've looked into that and they feel that you're suitable for the role, you then get asked to do a branch visit. So that is quite a unique approach from the enterprise mobility perspective, because what it is you obviously have your standard in-face interview, which you have at the branch, but before that interview, you have, well, it depends on the day, on the the employees or the manager's busyness. But for example, in my case, I had I think even close to 2 hours of time to just speak with the team, get to know what they kind of shadow them, I guess you could say, get familiar with what kind of things I'd be involved in and exposed to. And then obviously after the 2 hours, I had an interview and there was a yes and no from there.
Wow, okay. And you mentioned you're studying at UEA in Norwich, so you're based in Norwich, but the internship placement is in London. And that was okay for you, because did you intend to just sort of move back to London,
yes,
stay with family, friends, that sort of thing?
Yes, yeah. So I'm from London and I grew up in London. Obviously my family house is in London. And whilst I would have been open to a placement in Norwich, I think I probably would have been open to that. The actual advertisement was for a particular branch in London. So obviously living at home is a bit less financially straining than having to pay for another year of accommodation in Norwich.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And generally, do you think when you're looking for an internship, so Enterprise Mobility luckily had one in London and they have quite a few across the country, don't they? So depending on where you're studying or where you're from, you're probably going to find one nearby. Yeah. Do you know of people that really push themselves out of their, not even comfort zone, but literal zone in order to pursue a placement?
Yeah. I know friends from my year group who did a placement year as well in different degrees, but also my own. Um, and they did move out. They moved out to places that weren't even particularly big area, like big cities, as well. So I have a friend that moved somewhere in Gloucestershire, which was quite a quaint town. Yeah, exactly. And purely for the purpose of the role.
Yeah.
And I don't think he has any regrets.
Right. So he just sort of moved out, rented somewhere for the year, and then came back to finish the degree.
Exactly, yeah. I think he was he lived with his team or people relevant to the role, I believe, which I think often, especially the bigger employers, will have something like that set up. And even if they don't have, kind of a house sharing structure, they will have, people you can contact, websites you can reach out to and such.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would definitely, if you're looking for a placement or an internship, I wouldn't say no straight away just because of the location. Obviously, in enterprise mobility, from their perspective, it's a national operation. So, whilst my advertisement was for London, if they deemed that I was suitable for the role after that whole process, and I'm sure if I had a conversation with them, they'd actively find another branch that is ready to take me on in a more suitable area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And were you paid for your placement?
Yeah, so my placement was paid. I'm very grateful for the opportunity for it to have been paid, especially from a psychology background. It's very rare, actually. And I think if I was to do an NHS or a non-paid placement or internship, I think I'd be a lot more hesitant to move out, 100%. There's obviously you'd have to do a part-time job because a lot of the unpaid placements are 3 days a week. They're not actually full-time, understandably, because they can't expect you to stay afloat if it's full-time and it's unpaid. It just doesn't go hand in hand. So what they expect is you could take on a part-time role, hospitality, retail, or something like that, and that would normally pay for your kind of food and bills and stuff. But taking on that along with having to pay for a accommodation, I don't have any personal experience in it, but I can see how it can, be quite difficult to manage.
Yeah, absolutely. So you were in your internship, in your placement for a year.
Yeah.
What does the day-to-day look like? Were you just making the coffees or
No.
were you doing more?
No. I'd say there's obviously a lot of great things to take out from my placement at Enterprise Mobility, but one of the things that I really do like to tell my colleagues or anyone that asks really is Enterprise really do throw you in the deep end. And I think, in my opinion, that was the best thing possible because you have 1 year, right, where you're, as I said at the beginning, the main focus of me taking out that year in the first place, forget about Enterprise, but just solely taking out that year was so that I can gain experience. Now, if I was to be making coffees, there wouldn't be any experience to be gained. I can make a coffee anywhere. So yes, to answer your question, I was thrown into the deep end. Obviously, when I say thrown into the deep end, they were appreciative of the fact that I didn't have any experience in their systems, in their software, and in certain things, but they kind of guided me through that. But they didn't hold my hand, they didn't spoon feed me, kind of thing. They did let me make mistakes, and I did. To be fair, I did make quite a few, but I think that's a good thing because I've learned from them. So in the same environment or in similar environments in the future, I'm going to be in a place where I've been there and I've done that, right? So yeah, I did do a lot of stuff. For example, I was trusted with speaking to clients head face on. I had direct contact with them. I would manage accounts and reservations independently. There was no kind of assistance for managers. They had other things to do, a lot of other things to do, really, and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And what skills would you say that you picked up during your time?
Time management, definitely. Being thrown in the deep end when your, let's say, competency or skill is definitely not at the deep end level, shall we say, means that in order to reach that level, you do have to, be better at time management to kind of compensate and to build your competency up. So time management was really important for me, because obviously there's only so many hours in a day, you know, and some days got really busy. So that was one thing. Communication was really, really important. My particular branch or department that I worked in was a national operation. Normally, branches at Enterprise Mobility are more local, so in the London area, or even smaller than that, maybe a few mile radius, I guess you could say. Whereas we were a national operation working in a team of maybe 6 or 7 people. So with that came very important communication keys to avoid big mishaps. And there were times where the communication level did lack, and we obviously had to pay the price, which taught me that lesson.
And did you feel integrated into the team as just another member? You didn't feel ostracized as like the baby?
No, not at all. So each member of the team had their designated tasks. They were aware from the very early on what I had to do, and that kind of my responsibilities were very important to the overall operation, to the overall kind of stability of the operation. And if I made a mistake, it would have consequential impacts, right? So obviously what I was doing was very important because of that fact. So
And once you got to the end of the year and you're obviously now back completing your degree, have you been offered work at that place?
Yeah. So it's not. I have to say it's not common for the placement student to be offered the role back. I know I have a friend up at uni that also did the enterprise mobility placement, and unfortunately he wasn't offered that role. But yeah, thankfully I was. I had a meeting with my area manager. He sat me down. We went over my performance throughout the year. And another thing as well, enterprise mobility is very numbers driven. So obviously it's a numbers driven business, KPIs, and there's a lot of kind of dashboards that you look at on a monthly basis. So viewing and analyzing growth and overall performance is quite linear. Really, it's quite simple to do. So we just kind of sat down and said, look, at the beginning of the year we were here, but now we're here. And obviously we grew quite a lot in that year. So yeah, I did receive an offer. I did stay an extra, I think it was 3.5 months. So obviously it was a 12-month placement, which took me from June to June. And I had that summer ahead of me. And if I hadn't stayed there, I would have got a hospitality or part-time job anyway. So I did ask the question. I said, look, would you be open to keeping me on? Obviously they did pay me during that time, so they could have said no. But I'm very grateful that they didn't. And I'm carrying on that kind of trajectory as a campus brand manager as well. So I still liaise with Monica and everyone else at Enterprise. I attend career fairs, and I kind of try to advertise the management training program from a student perspective, as opposed to from a manager perspective, if you see
Yeah,
what I
of course. So you've got the job waiting for you once you graduate. Obviously, like, that's amazing. Do you feel a disconnect between your degree and what you've gone into? Do you see yourself at Enterprise Mobility forever, or are you just like, this is a great stepping stone, I'm really happy here, and it's sort of a really lucky thing that you've landed in this job that, even though it's quite different from your degree, it's worked out really well for you?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a passion for occupational and organizational psychology, which is kind of, psychology in the workplace, business psychology, kind of people management and such. A lot of those things were involved in the business, the management training program. So it does cover a lot of the bases that I am interested in. It doesn't cover all, absolutely. I don't think many placements could cover all. So I would say I'd be very keen on staying, because I think the kind of structure is very appealing to a young individual, in the sense that there's a lot of room for promotion. There's a lot of room for, obviously, with the promotions, salary increases. You do get paid, I'd say, quite healthily and quite proportionally to what you put into the business. It is sales driven in the majority of branches. So if you know, can put that work in, and as I said, the dashboards can verify that, then it's a very great place to be.
So tell me a bit more about the management scheme. Is that something that's only offered as a placement to students?
Yeah, so the title that I had was Enterprise Mobility Management Trainee. So that was the internship title. So if I was to stay on after uni, I'd go in as a management trainee, and then you have to complete like I guess the best way to summarize it is a competency test. So there's like 5 key almost modules that kind of cover all the different areas of the business: risk, cost reduction, cost control, and a few other pieces. As long as in that interview you can show the manager that you've gained valuable experience that you can transfer to the official role, and then you become a management trainee or an assistant management, one of the two. I just can't remember now. And then it kind of just goes up from there, really.
What did you find the most challenging aspect?
It's interesting because I'd say the best aspect is that you're thrown in the deep end, but the most challenging aspect is also you're thrown in the deep end, if that makes sense. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. Now in hindsight, I'm talking about it in a very kind of glorious manner, but in the heat of it, it can be quite intense. Because you're just constantly learning. It's like learning a new language. Everything is so unfamiliar with yourself. You never feel like you can fully comprehend it. But that was probably the most difficult thing. And with that came a lot of other things like communication. And there were times where my judgment didn't align with the manager's judgment, and because they gave me so much independency, I obviously made important decisions, without the requirements of the manager's input, and obviously in the best interests to the business. Sometimes that did backfire, and then when we kind of went over, the like, obviously I had a conversation with our manager and we spoke about it, and I kind of gave him my perspective. He said, "Look, next time, I appreciate your perspective, but next time be this." Those are difficult conversations to have because no one likes messing up, right? It was difficult, especially on a scale of what I was working with as well, and so that was difficult to kind of have those conversations. But yeah,
worth it.
yeah, worth it for sure. No, for sure.
And if you hadn't been offered a place at Enterprise Mobility, would you feel confident going into the workplace and into the job seeking market with everything that you took from your placement?
100%. I think I've grown like tenfold, really. They're kind of training, they're kind of employee development training modules. I don't really know what the technical term is, but their kind of structure in that sense is very, very strong. You have, I think, 4 kind of days within that 1 year that I was there where you go to the head office and they sit all the interns together from all around the country. So, it was based in Heathrow, but you had people coming from Scotland and everywhere. And for that 4 times in that year, we were taught like in thorough detail the 4 or 5 key modules that I mentioned that were in that interview that you then need to do at the end of the year. So it kind of meant that even if your branches didn't teach you sufficiently, everyone is on the same level. They should be, at least, because you've had that, there's 4 days where you've been kind of taught it outside the business, if that makes sense. So yeah, I do think I'm a better person because it covers a wide variety of business, and it's not just one thing, and I become really good at it, but I've become really good at all the elements of managing a business.
Yeah. What advice would you give to people that are considering doing an internship? Let's say as well that their degree doesn't offer a place in industry. Sort of at what point would you suggest they start looking into applying for internships, and should they do it?
So in the case of a placement, So obviously I did a placement year. So second year, by the end of second year, I needed to know that I had secured a placement, right? So I'd say start looking early as possible, and especially in this employment crisis that we're going through. It's more important than ever, really, to start looking as soon as possible, and that can start from October, November, and I definitely would say by December for sure, because it gives you a bit of time and a bit of a cushion to kind of familiarize yourself with your strengths, and to cater your CV towards that, to cater your applications towards those strengths. And it's also a numbers game as well. I'd say I'm quite a competent person, but even I had a number of rejections. There's people that are even more competent than me, and they probably have same, if not more, rejections than me. So it is a numbers game, and to kind of try to tackle that, time is against you, really. So the earlier you start, the more applications you can get through.
Mm-hmm. And like, what advice would you give to stand out in your application? Like, what do you think you did to get yours?
I think I stood out most in my in-person interview. It's really difficult to stand out from a CV perspective, unless you're an exceptional student. You've done 4 or 5 extracurricular stuff, which I'd say most people have only done maybe 2 or 3. I think from the interview standpoint, I was really, I'd say, obviously dressed for the occasion, and I kind of went over the top. I came in a whole suit, and some people would say that's doing too much, but even if it is doing too much, they're gonna remember that, right? Whether it's for the better or for the worse, when they're thinking about who to say on, they'll be like, oh, the guy who's in the suit, right? So I dressed up in a suit, which made me stand out. I'm not saying everyone should dress up in a suit, but you get where I'm coming from. They obviously don't dress up in casual, like joggers, for example. But other than that, I showed an exceptional level of confidence as well. That was just confidence in myself. It wasn't necessarily confidence relating to the role. It was just that when they asked me questions, I had that genuine belief that even if I didn't have a direct answer, I had experience to kind of weave my way around into the answer, if that makes sense. And I think that confidence they definitely saw that.
And has that come with time? Have you applied to a lot of things and sat in a lot of interviews and learned that, or was it just something that you went in with and you were like, right, well, I've got to appear confident even if I'm not necessarily?
No, of course. I mean, I think a lot of it was the preparation. So of all the interviews that I got to, I would always, before obviously a couple of days leading up to it, I'd have a look back at the kind of the job description and the skills that they require from yourself, and you kind of associate past experience relating it to the skills. For example, hospitality, customer facing, time management as well, all sorts of skills that you can relate to, not that weren't directly business management related. Again, I had no experience in business management, so I knew whatever questions that they would ask in terms of experience, or describe a time when this happened, describe a time when that happened, I'd have to go back to my roots, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that kind of helps me feel a bit more confident when I was asked those questions, because I didn't panic. I kind of just took a step back, and I was able to tell them a story of what happened and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today.
No problem.